Thank you, everyone, and thanks for joining the conversation today. I'm glad to be here. I'm familiar with the work of your center, and like was said earlier, the center plays an important role in Participedia. So I'm glad to be part of this conversation, particularly with the reference to decolonizing democracy. The slides I'm using, we're actually not prepared for this talk. I was just going to speak until it was suggested to me as we started a few minutes ago, hey, why don't you show some slides? So I pulled up a slide I was going to use later this week to try and encourage some of my colleagues here at the university to use Participedia more in their classroom. So if the slides don't quite align with what I'm saying, no, that's the reason, but generally it will speak to the general themes that I want to raise today. So I'll start, I plan to do 3 things in the 30 minutes I have to speak today. The first is just to broadly speak to what Participedia is. What is Participedia and where it is today? What are the goals and the objective of this partnership and this project? Secondly, I will speak about what Participedia has accomplished, what we think we've been able to accomplish, not just in this second phase of the project, but throughout the project. And then finally, I will speak about some of the challenges that we face and continue to face with Participedia, one of which is how we do participatory democracy and how we do democratic innovations with a decolonial lens. That's one of the challenges. But let me start with Participedia. As you've heard, it's a global network of researchers, educators, practitioners, and policymakers working on public participation and civic inclusion. So the first phase of this project was really led by Mike Warren at the University of British Columbia, and it ran for about 5 years. And the first phase of the project was really the foundation of the Participedia project. What I am leading is the second phase of the project here at McMaster University, and why there are many continuities between the vision of the first phase, we centered more on deliberative democracy, and the more diffused vision that we have with the second phase. There are a lot of connections and parallels between them. So the Participedia is essentially founded around the platform that we run, participedia.net, which you can think about it, the way I describe it to people, is the Wikipedia for democratic innovation. So it's a crowdsourced platform generating research and mobilizing knowledge on democratic innovation, public participation, and civic engagement. Now, take note of the other aspects of that definition: democratic innovation, public participation, and civic engagement, because I will speak a little bit about that later on, why we have extended the conversation about what we do beyond the D word, the democracy word. And it speaks to the connection between the discourse on decolonization, that there are ways we can think about what we do in ways that transcend our conventional and orthodox understanding of democracy. So increasingly, alongside democracy, we emphasize public participation in whatever form and in however way people choose to represent that. But we also now emphasize civic engagement in ways that various communities seek to do that. So democratic innovation really goes alongside public participation and civic engagement. We have, I think these figures have now changed. We have over 3,000 cases now. We have about 400 methods and organizations from around the world. And in Participedia Phase 1, many of the case studies we had tended to center around Europe and North America, and dealt with traditional forms of deliberative democracy as the indices of democratic innovation. One of the things we sought to do with this second phase of the project is to make Participedia a really global project, to go beyond the cases that we had gathered, from Europe and North America, and to begin to think about what democratic innovation, public participation, and civic engagement looks like in other parts of the world, in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa. So we've really, in the past 2 years, done more to broaden the framework of the study. We've also broadened the focus of Participedia. So like I said earlier, the first phase really started as a deliberative democracy project, focused essentially on participatory democracy, deliberative governance. And it achieved quite a lot in that respect. But with the second phase of the project, we thought there was an opportunity to go beyond deliberative democracy, to begin to think about other ways in which individuals and community are innovating in the democratic space that might not quite fit into that traditional box that we call deliberative democracy. So Participedia is now organized around 5 clusters, actually 6 clusters: human and political rights, which I lead, democratic accountability, democratic representation, democracy across borders, and digital democracy. And we recognize that although these are distinct research clusters within the broader project, there are connections between them, and there are obvious connections between all of these. Beyond the research clusters, we also have themes, because one of the big challenges of organizing a big research project like this around clusters is that there's always a tendency for siloing, where clusters, begin to do their own things, and in some ways you lose the coherence of the project. So one of the ways that we sought to maintain the coherence of the project was to build the clusters around, connect them with themes. And we have 3 teams. We have the teaching, training, and mentoring team. We have the research team, and we have the design and technology team. The research team is really the hub that brings all the clusters together. And so far, I must say, it's worked. We're working within our various research clusters, and every once in a while, we come together for what we call design workshops, to learn about what every cluster is doing and to think about the common themes that cut across our research agendas within the cluster. So in June, we will be having our all partners meeting. Again, that is a forum where we get to have conversations beyond the clusters to think about the overarching goals of the project. So these like I said, these are topics I'm trying to get my colleagues to bring into the classroom on Participedia. But let me speak about at least one of the work that I have been doing in my cluster, which is the human rights cluster. So we've really been focused on truth and reconciliation commissions that seem to have proliferated around the world as innovative democratic spaces, particularly in fragile democracies and in post-conflict context. So in many parts of the world, particularly in post-developing countries in Latin America and Africa, and to some extent also increasingly seeing the Middle East and Asia, truth commissions have become a way of transitioning societies from conflict or authoritarian rule towards a stable democracy, fledgling democracies, if you like. And we're beginning to see the truth commissions being used as spaces for discussing what the future of the post-conflict state or the post-authoritarian state would look like. We've seen a lot of this in Latin America. We've seen a lot of this in Africa. So what we're doing now is that we are really studying truth and reconciliation commissions as examples of deliberative democratic spaces. And we're doing a collection of global truth commissions within our Participedia, focusing on specific case studies. A colleague of mine is also using Participedia. This is a classic example of how Participedia works in the classroom. She's using it for a class where she's talking about getting the students to think about how these are business students in the business school that typically don't think about things like this, but they're thinking about how co-ops, co-working spaces can be deliberative and democratic spaces or spaces for democratic innovations. One of the things we're very proud of is, governments are beginning to see Participedia as a knowledge repository. So we do have now a Government of Canada Privy Council collection in Participedia, where Government of Canada initiatives are documented within Participedia. So these are some of the achievements that I would say we've made in the past few years. We've grown. We've become, I would say, Participedia has become a premier database for democratic innovations around the world. And thanks to partners like your center, we continue to grow and expand. But as we grow and expand, we are facing a lot of challenges that you can expect with an organization and a network that is growing and expand. And I will speak to two of these challenges, and then maybe now begin to speak about how we are seeking to address them. So the first challenge we have is an epistemological one. We've typically framed Participedia as a project centered around democratic innovations. Well, what is democratic innovations? Well, the general, we've thought about these, are innovations happening on the ground that go beyond, our traditional notions of electoral democracy, whether these are deliberative mini publics, citizen assemblies, citizen budgeting, and all these innovations that have happened. And increasingly, as Participedia expands, we are finding that both researchers within the Participedia project are questioning that notion of innovation. What amounts to innovation? How do you measure innovation? And there's concern that the very rigid definition of what constitutes innovation may exclude other ways of knowing, of understanding civic engagement in governance. And one of the examples that we're hearing about increasingly indigenous ways of organizing societies here in Canada, in Latin America, and in various societies. And so we are thinking more and more these days about how we understand innovation, what constitutes innovation. We are also very attentive to trying to include societies where much of what we do isn't framed in terms of democracy. And this would apply to many countries in the world where grassroots organizations, individuals are organizing, they're engaging in governance, they're innovating, but the language isn't just framed as democracy, either for ideological reasons or because of the political contingencies in those countries. Now, how do we get them into the conversation? How do we get those voices that do not see themselves within the D word, whether capital D or small letter D? How do we get them into the conversation of Participedia? So that is the first epistemological questions that we're grappling with. And as I said earlier, one of the ways we're dealing with that is to emphasize terms such as civic inclusion and participatory public participation as much as we emphasize democracy. In other words, in some ways, while democracy and our commitment to espouse on the values of democracy remains the core of the Participedia project, we are increasingly recognizing that in order to do that well, the discourses have to be more amenable to various ways of understanding what participation looks like. The other challenge we're facing with Participedia is that as we grow and begin to go into what I call controversial areas of democratic participation, and I explain what I mean shortly, we're having to deal with the questions of editorial oversight. So in phase one of the project, when the project centered almost exclusively on deliberative democracy, this wasn't much of a problem. Many of the cases, and you have to remember, these are all crowdsourced. So anyone with internet connection can write an entry on Participedia. We didn't have much problem. But now we are dealing with human rights, which leads to all kinds of questions about state repression, about violence, about censorship, about extremism, about fake news. So you're dealing with human rights, and we're seeing that firsthand in my human rights cluster, the cases that are beginning to pop up. But we're also dealing with something else. We're dealing with questions about the democratic governance, for instance, cluster is dealing with cases of corruption, where cases are being uploaded to Participedia that are obviously propagandist. We're also receiving concerns from people saying that Participedia cases on corruption in particular countries really are political and ideological and are intended to disparage those countries or those societies. In the case of human rights, for instance, we've had case entries on Participedia dealing with extremist group mobilizing to prevent immigration, xenophobic groups, and these are all put on Participedia as examples of democratic participation, small letter D. So we're caught, in some kind of paradox in that on the one hand, we want Participedia to continue to be this open source, free, everyone can use it kind of database that reflects how innovation is happening on the ground. But increasingly, we are confronted with cases on Participedia that are problematic, either because they kind of straddle that very delicate boundary between free speech and hate speech. We had a case recently of a white supremacist group that was put on Participedia, that was brought to our notice, and it was presented as a case of democratic participation because this extremist group was organizing to prevent immigration in a particular country. It was organizing to stop refugees. It was essentially an exclusionary group, a xenophobic group, but it had been framed in the Participedia entry as democratic participation. Here are people organizing to be part of local politics. And so we're getting more and more of those kind of cases. And so what do? On the one hand, we realize that as a crowdsourced platform, we have a moral and ethical obligation not to be a platform for the dissemination of fake news, toxic digital communications, and hate speech. So we're very well aware of that, particularly those of us in the human rights cluster. But we are also very conscious of the concern that we do not become the gatekeepers of this knowledge. And that is something that has come up again, that we are not seen as fostering what one has described as epistemic hierarchies. We are not shutting out people that do not agree with what we think. And so how do you strike that delicate balance in the context of all the talk about decolonizing, allowing 1,000 flowers bloom, and opening up the space for voices that have been historically marginalized in conversations about democracy and civic inclusion? And that is where we find ourselves today. So what we've come up with is some kind of editorial policy. We're still working on this. The first thing we had to do was we had to come up with a mission statement that espouses what our core values are within Participedia. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read a bit of that mission statement, which took a lot of thinking through for us to come up with. So in the mission statement, we say this. We say, although we are committed to democratic ideals, Participedia does not advance any ideological, programmatic, institutional, or government agenda. We believe that there are many ways to advance democracy and that they will differ by place, history, culture, and the context-based challenges that each society faces. We recognize existing inequities and inequalities in the collection, theorization, and mobilization of knowledge about non-Western forms of democratic innovations. Participedia is committed to working to address this imbalance. We also recognize that not all cases and methods documented by Participedia will advance democracy, and that impacts will vary by context. Our mission is to mobilize knowledge about democracy, enhancing practices and institutions that will support answers to the question, what kinds of democratic innovation work best and for what purposes and under what conditions? So this is a very, and if you go to the Participedia website, you will see the full mission statement there. And this is a very carefully crafted statement that is our own attempt to strike that delicate balance of being a crowdsourced platform that also wants to be ethical and responsible about how we curate these material that we are the custodians of. And this is not just a challenge for Participedia. Anyone who's been following the big social media companies, Google, Twitter, Instagram, and all these other big technology companies, they are also dealing with these concerns about content moderation. But unlike Google and Twitter, Participedia is a small research cluster of researchers. We work on the shoestring budget. We do not have the resources that these big companies have to devote to content moderation. But what we can do is to make our principles very clear, and which is what we've done. And we are also now working on an editorial policy where certain Participedia entries will get a green check mark. And those will be entries that we have reviewed, that has gone through some form of peer review. And we can say to the public and to those who rely on our database that these have gone through some kind of content review. We do not anticipate that most of Participedia entries will go through that process because, like I said before, we are conscious about not being gatekeepers to this knowledge. But we do see value in reviewing certain cases, giving them a bit of permanence, because we're increasingly seeing Participedia content cited in the media, used in journal articles. And so we feel that there is value in having a peer review system, not a very rigorous one, I might add, but a peer review system where certain cases on our platform get a check mark that gives the public some confidence that this has gone through some kind of oversight process. So this is where we are as a project. It remains a work in progress. It is not an easy one, but I'm confident that it is one that will ultimately address some of the concerns we're facing. Just see if I have any other things in my slide I could briefly speak to before I close, because I'm also keen to have a conversation going. So one of the things we've been pushing, and maybe I should mention this here, is encouraging Participedia in the classroom, because we found from experience that that is where these problems that we face are brainstormed. You know, students have ideas about how we solve this problem. So in some ways, bringing Participedia into the classroom is one way of addressing some of the challenges I just outlined. So the teaching and learning team have been organizing these teaching cafes. They call them Participedia in the Classroom Cafe, where we expose graduate and undergraduate students to some of these challenging cases and deliberate on how we address them within the context of Participedia. And we do have resources that have been developed for anyone who's interested in using Participedia in the classroom. We have how-to videos, we have sample syllables and curriculum that have been developed that you can draw. Yes, that's about it. So I welcome your questions and look forward to the conversations that will follow. Thank you very much.